Watching news at Prime, let's get into this conversation now. The Standing Committee on Appropriations has decried the lack of involvement and consultation when it comes to budget planning. The Finance Minister tomorrow is expected to outline the country's spending plans after last month's speech was postponed due to the conflict over a possible VAT hike. The committee chairperson is Mmusi Maimane, who joins us now. Mr. Maimane, good evening to you. Thank you very much for your time. Can I start with perhaps what could be a far-fetched idea, at least in your eyes, or perhaps you might believe that I'm on the right track here. What happens if this budget is not passed? Are there mechanisms that help ameliorate that?
Well, I think let's understand that the budget is the same as any other law. And so effectively, what begins to happen is that what the minister will table tomorrow are proposals. It then post that will serve in our committee as the Division of Revenue Act and the Appropriations Bill. Both those laws are what we now typically call the budget. It goes for public consultation, which will happen. South Africans have every right to make input. And then post that, a vote is then taken by this National Assembly to achieve whether it then gets sent to the National Council of Provinces and then to the President for signature. So what will happen tomorrow are mere proposals. And I want to go to great lengths to remind South Africans that the job of Parliament is to give us expression to their aspirations, to make sure that their inputs are considered. And the law makes it possible for Parliament to reject, amend, or to make recommendations in the budget as is envisaged in the Money Bills Act. And so we've still got a long way to go before whatever is tabled tomorrow becomes the law of the country.
Agreed. But I think my question still stands, and you've actually helped us understand that what tomorrow is going to be presented are, I don't want to use the word mere proposals, but are firm proposals. But it then is up to the processes thereafter that help get this budget passed. But what I'm saying is that we have seen many firsts. What happens if the budget is rejected? Are there mechanisms to try and deal with that?
Yeah, and I mean, I think post that, we then go into what would be, in my view, some of the legal and constitutional crisis spaces we'd never thought we'd go into. The immediate proposal, it does make provisions as to how much spending can happen. So 45% of departmental spending can then occur until it becomes the law. But then there needs to be a process upon which this engagement can take place. I would hope that as a country would never get there because we're dealing with a crisis genuinely of unemployment, genuinely of a lack of growth. But if that were to happen and we can begin to have that conversation in the second half of the year rather than in this first half, I do believe that we will be able to find a workable way forward and achieve a budget that is voted upon, that relies on the constitutional provisions, and then we can go from there. So I'm confident of that score. But it will take a very significant process for us to get to the place you are describing, where effectively there aren't enough votes to carry the budget through. Yeah.
Let's then deal with what we have said earlier as we were introducing this particular discussion. You have decried the lack of involvement or consultation in the budget build-up process. The Finance Minister, very clear that the budget, by its very nature, carries very sensitive information and at times market-sensitive information. How much access there needs to be, or how much consultation must the Finance Minister conduct before he gets to what he's going to do tomorrow?
Well, I think it's not for me to make that suggestion to the Finance Minister. It's the Intergovernmental Fiscal Framework, which is the law that governs this type of consultation. One of the institutions is the FFC, which is the Finance and Fiscal Commission, which the Minister is enjoined to consult. It is in the act, it is in the law. And furthermore, when it comes to post the tabling exercise, South Africans have a voice. You and I can make input into that budget in the way that the law capacitates us to do it in the Money Bills Act. So in many ways, I think we mustn't feel like the minister would be doing anyone a favor. He or she would merely be complying with the law. That is on the first instance. The second is that as it comes to the politics of the GNU on one end, I think that is a fairly different process in terms of what needs to be engaged on that score. I am sympathetic to the minister that the figures and all of that become tricky. But here is what the opportunity looks like post the tabling of the budget. Here are the two fundamental choices we have to make. The first is whether we increase VAT by 2% or, in essence, we scrap the SRD grant. Would it not give political parties an opportunity to vote as to how they express their choices, so that when it comes back to the electorate, South Africans will know which parties were pro the increasing of the VAT or pro the decreasing of or the reduction of the SRD? Because these matters are where we are as a country. We have to make tough choices. We have to fund for infrastructure. And what my job is, as the Appropriations Committee, is to identify all of the work that happens in wasteful, fruitless expenditure, or expenditure that doesn't lead itself to growth, or expenditure that, in my view, is at odds with where the priority areas are, and give Parliament the right for them to express a choice in those areas. And I think that is what it is to be able to build an efficient government. The choices we have to make now are not on the income side. Yeah. They are genuinely on the expenditure side, what gets cut. And I think political parties in Parliament must be given the right to give expression to those choices.
Well, let me go back to one of the issues that you have raised in this response that you have just given, the VAT discussion. And it would appear that it is going to be something that we are all looking to see whether or not it remains in the minister's speech. Tonight, I think about an hour ago, News 24, quoting an IMF representative who was talking in a webinar today, and they are suggesting that for any permanent new spending, such as a social welfare grant, we are talking SRD here, and there are those who are saying if the SRD goes, then it means that it automatically should be replaced by the basic income grant. IMF is saying this new spending should be paid for with new revenue streams. And that's what the finance minister was emphasizing on this show on Sunday. Where do you stand as the Appropriations Committee?
Polly, I stand at the school of thought that says that South Africa must focus on growth. No one has ever taxed themselves to prosperity. So on the first instance, I don't think a VAT increase is going to help that. It disproportionately affects the poor, even if you zero rate a basket of goods. The growth plan must focus itself on infrastructure and public-private partnerships. And so for me, I would be tabling alongside with that an ambitious, bold plan to say we are going to attract investment in, for example, I'll take one aspect, recovery of rail and logistics infrastructure. You do that, you interconnect multiple provinces, you increase tourism, and you've got a better probability of being able to see what is now at below 1% GDP growth to about 2 to 3% growth. On the SRD issue, this is a very difficult decision we have to make. And I am of the view that at this point in time, it's a 37 billion rands ticket as it comes through. If the Constitutional Court ruling, which has been granted, increases excess, which is, it ruled that it was unconstitutional to limit excess, if you have to comply just with that Constitutional Court ruling, it would take that 37 billion rands and move it north of 50 billion rands, in which instance it becomes even further unaffordable. So I hold the view that, one, it will be difficult, but we have to face up to the fact that it was a COVID grant. It doesn't mean that it has to be an SR, it has to be a basic income grant. It was a COVID grant that perhaps we need to withdraw. But as we withdraw it, the policy shift must be that, coming back to my earlier point about infrastructure-led growth, you then create an extended public works program to which all of the respective numbers of beneficiaries that sit in that program can apply for that work, get it, begin to earn an income through it, and then you don't make it a grant, you make it an employment creation scheme that's focused on rail. But you have to be willing to make the tough decision. If we don't do that and simply say, well, we'll increase VEST by 1% and then we will keep the SRD grant, next year it will face up inflationary pressures, which means you'll have to increase it. You'll have to comply with the Concord. And more crucially, in a country that is already borrowing itself to beyond junk status, to increase borrowing would be to really take a knife to the South African economy. So it's a time for choices. This is not a debate about we can do everything. It's a time for choices, and we have to make choices that are sustainable, that are pro-growth, and that must be a fundamental focus in our country.
If social spending, Mr. Maimane, such as the SRD grant, is to go away, the Minister of Finance very clear that economic growth is what the country needs in order to get there. But how do you achieve that with an Eskom that once again appears to be a going concern?
Well, Kole, I think sometimes we need to take a step back a little bit and ask ourselves the question, how did we find ourselves in this situation? And we find ourselves in this point because effectively money was stolen. Hundreds of billions of rands was stolen. So when somebody wants to now ask South Africans to pay for money that was stolen by an increase in VAT, that's how we must look at it. And therefore, it would be unfair for people who were defrauded to now suddenly also be asked to cover that loss. Having said that, I also hold the absolute view that when you look at Eskom and where it sits and its debt instruments, already we've adjudicated as an appropriations committee a number of bailouts towards SOEs. It is now a time that we begin to rationalize some of those SOEs. On the energy provision point of view, I do think that keeping Eskom as one entity is unsustainable. It has its own compliance with its own debt structures, and so it must continue to do that. The splitting in terms of market reaction from a generation to a distribution company, that is necessary given the competitive elements that go into this issue. What we now need to do is figure out how do we ring-fence that debt, give capacity to municipalities who can reticulate or give out their own energy, and introduce new competition in the space. It is the only way we are going to sustain that question. Yeah. A cross-defaulting Eskom is going to be disastrous for the South African economy in total. So we need to think about that in a way that says what is sustainable, how do we help municipalities stop wasting money? Because the biggest risk to Eskom's fiscal sustainability is equally so municipal debt, which is scheduled to peak at about 130 billion rands in the medium term. So my genuine proposal is that let's go back, capacitate municipalities, make sure they're effective at collection so that they can honor their obligations to Eskom.
Well, you've touched on it, and we're going to end on that very point. Municipalities, today, during the question and answer session, it was your question to the President as to whether or not the city of Johannesburg should be placed under administration. I'd like for us first to listen to his response, and you'll tell us whether you were satisfied with what he had to say. Let's listen to the President now.
The banks themselves are very keen to work with our metro government there to revamp and to revive the city, but more importantly, to make sure that service delivery is delivered in the way that our citizens or our residents in Johannesburg expect. So short of calling for administration, which can also be a very long legislative process, there is now a new energy that has been injected to all stakeholders, be it academics, be it young people. They all came together when I was there, and they committed themselves to working to turn Johannesburg around. And I do believe that Johannesburg will be turned around.
Workable solution, Mr. Maimane, or pie in the sky? kind of talk?
Johannesburg is in an absolute crisis. It is not going to take more committees, more goodwill, more any of that. Whilst you are processing the ability to place Johannesburg under administration, certainly the province has got a crucial role to play. But I would have by now, through the Ministry of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs, appointed a very strong administrator, coordinate what the response is there. Because the question was well within the context of infrastructure build, which has affected the people of Johannesburg in that communities are without water. Some aspects have got load reduction because of aging infrastructure. The road infrastructure in Johannesburg is collapsing. We cannot afford that to the largest metro in Africa. And therefore, it is an urgent call. Otherwise, you will be taking pension money, which is what the president proposed, and throwing it into a bottomless pit that Johannesburg could quickly become. So I want to urgently say we need an administrator now and ensure that we execute a timeless plan to turn Joburg around for the people of Johannesburg. Otherwise, we're going to have a problem. And certainly going into next year's election, citizens can express a vote on that issue. But in the meantime, between a year and now, Johannesburg cannot deteriorate any further. We are losing investment, we're losing property values, we're losing infrastructure in Johannesburg, and it's been through multiple leadership areas. That's why I think it needs an urgent administrator to take control of what happens in that city. And the president lives there, so he would have seen the streets that he walks in, the places that he drives around. It is not enough to say, well, goodwill will sort it out. It needs deliberate and urgent action now.
Mmusi Maimane, thank you very much for your time. Chairperson of the Standing Committee on Appropriations in Parliament.